that I will read word for word. Rather, I have made extensive notes from which I will do the presentation. I want to make a couple introductory comments, and that is, it is an informal paper, and I need to thank various individuals who have helped me in the preparation of this. Judd Lake's book has been very helpful. There's a young Adventist historian in Florida by the name of Kevin Burton, who's been very helpful in some of his material that he has shared. Articles by Victor Hurlbert, article by Ted Wilson, Denise Kaiser, all have been helpful. And archive statistics and research. Your department has been extremely helpful. David, I want to thank you publicly. And I don't know who else all worked on it, but I know Ashley has been very helpful. Ashley Chisholm is a very capable researcher and most helpful. And Tim Poyer from the White Estate, I also want to thank you for helping with some of the material that I've had. I'm reflecting on a specific belief of the Seventh-day Adventist Reformed movement as stated in fundamental belief number 18. In part, I'm not reading the entire fundamental belief, but in part it reads as follows. It is the duty of every Christian to obey the laws of the land as long as they do not conflict with the law of God. Some texts are given. I continue. The Word of God does not allow us to take part in political plans, partisan activities, riots, bloodshed, or war. A number of texts are given. However, we are prepared to contribute to the welfare of society as conscientious objectors performing work of national importance under civilian direction in a manner which is not inconsistent with our beliefs. You, of course, all of you have access to the entire fundamental belief, but I've read portions of it in order to introduce our topic for today. What do Christians do in a time of war? Christians, along with other people, face the horrors of war. The faith of the Christian is not a guarantee that it will not suffer in the war. Just last week, 7 or 8 days ago, I was driving with my wife through Bosnia. And all these years later, you see the terrible scars of war. You see what were one time beautiful home buildings where children played and parents raised their children, now empty shells, a monument to the horror of war. I drove just north of the city of Banja Luka. Peter, that's where you were born, right?
My father and my brother.
Your father, yeah. I drove there, and in order to get to my destination where I was going, I had to drive past the sites of the 3 concentration camps where I was as a young child. And I don't dwell there long. There are no signs, but I know where those camps were. And I know what my family went through. And we're not the only ones. Some of us have survived the horrors of the war, others have not. Faithfulness to our faith is not always a guarantee of survival. But Christians also face the question of their participation in the war. And if so, how? How do they participate? The church also faces the horrors of war. Does the church, here's the question, does the church take a formal position, or does the church leave the issue of participation to each individual person? If it takes a formal position, how does it treat members with different views? Those are some of the questions the Seventh-day Adventist Church and individuals have faced. Adventists, along with others, have faced terrible consequences of war. What were they to do? What position would the church take? What about the draft that is oftentimes instituted during war? One Seventh-day Adventist leader wrote the following, quote, "In the case of drafting, the government assumes the responsibility of the violation of the law of God, and it would be madness to resist." End of quotation. That position, incidentally, is somewhat similar to the position that Luther took when he spoke about how to deal with the question, as he called them, with the Turks, the Ottoman Empire. They were invading, coming up to Vienna about a year after he wrote his booklet. It was a major issue for the war. And Luther was also saying that the individual cannot serve in the war as a Christian but only as a citizen of his country. What was the response, the statement to this Adventist leader's word that I spoke? I quote, "Most respondents were in essential agreement with this view. The view ranged, however, from non-cooperation on one end of the spectrum to full-fledged competency on the other. One individual advocated a regiment of Sabbath keepers." First time I ran across that suggestion. This individual maintained that based on the Old Testament and the New Testament, killing was not a violation of God's law. He, quote, prayed that God would destroy the enemy. These views, some opposing war, some advocating participation in the war, and some placing the responsibility of violating God's law on the government, seem to reflect intense disagreement among Seventh Adventists during World War I. But what I have shared with you did not take place during World War I. It took place in the U.S. Civil War. Something that I kind of had to research myself to figure out what was going on. Most of the time we discuss the issue of war and what our stand should be in a particular war, we usually refer to World War I. It's usually what is done in these type of discussions. But we need to go back some 50 years or more to the very formative years of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Seventh-day Adventists before and during the Civil War. In general, Adventists advocated the need to be law-abiding citizens, whether it's the Millerites or whether the early Seventh-day Adventists. But when it came to slavery issue, many of them violated the laws of the land. A significant number participated in the Underground Railroad. It was an illegal act. They were acting against the United States government when they participated in the Underground Railroad, when they helped people to go up to Canada to escape. Their routes that were all worked out through New York and Vermont and other places. They did it because they believed they were serving a higher law, God's law. In view of the fact that most Adventists were Northerners in those early days, and in view of their anti-slavery views, it is not surprising that they saw slavery as a major issue of the Civil War, which today, by the way, is being challenged by individuals throughout the United States, trying to make it sound as if slavery was a minor or at least a secondary issue. If you take the time to look at the Confederate Constitution, not what people say about it, but you actually read the Constitution, slavery was embedded in the federal Constitution. So slavery was a major issue. Most Adventists saw the U.S. Civil War as a rebellion. These are the words they used. What to do with the rebels became a point of discussion among Adventists. Though later he modified his views, it was James White who wrote, "In the case of drafting, the government assumes the responsibility of the violation of the law of God and will be madness to resist." He wrote it especially in the context of dealing with a number of Seventh-day Adventists in the state of Iowa, who he felt and Ellen White felt had taken an extreme position. And it's James White who wrote those words. Question: did the Seventh-day Adventists answer the draft as combatants? And furthermore, did they volunteer for the U.S. Army, the U.S. military? According to Burton, this is the gentleman I referred to earlier, in practice, numerous Adventists had voluntarily enlisted since April 1861, while others had paid the commutation fee since the early fall of 1862. By 1865, hundreds of Adventists were serving in the Army, and the majority served as combatants either willingly or unwillingly. Unwillingly were the ones that were drafted, of course. Burton has compiled from official records, not hearsay, a list of Seventh-day Adventists who were in the military. Either they were drafted or they volunteered to serve. The list keeps growing. I've talked to Kevin several times. While he has documented something like 80 or 90 individuals, he believes that the list will eventually be 200 to 300, maybe 350 individuals. who served in the war, either as volunteer or as draftees. But here's the short list that he has compiled until earlier this year, about a year ago. Adventists who volunteered, 53. 53. I even looked at the ranks of those individuals, and the highest rank was a captain, which means a leading officer in the military. Those who were drafted, 13. All privates except one or two just simply said rank unknown. Those who converted to Adventism while in the war, 15. So during the war, a number of individuals went in as non-Seventh Adventists, and during the war, they were witnessed to by other Adventists, and they became Seventh Adventists. The highest rank, again, a captain. Those who were exempted, he found a list of 13 individuals for the following reasons: health, fee payment, we've heard all about that, citizenship. One of them said, I'm a Canadian, so you can't draft me. That was his argument. And one of them, the most interesting one that I found, advocacy from the church elder. We don't know what the church elder said or did, but we know that the church elder helped this one individual stay out of the military. Let's remember, even 80 or 90 individuals were comparing this to a church that was in the 3,000s, small denomination at that time. Okay, but the list is growing, keeps growing, literally week by week it keeps growing. Though no one from James and Ann White's family, their immediate family, served in the war that we know of, I don't know if some of their distant relatives did. David, you may be able to shed some light on that later. War enthusiasm impacted the White family. Edson, who was about 12 years old, and Henry, who was about 14 years old, showed interest in the war. They built their own drums, warlike weapons, such as bows and arrows, and shot, as it was said, troublesome birds, as if they were in battle. That's what those two youngsters did. And then, I quote, the captain of a battalion of soldiers who were drilling in the fairgrounds in Battle Creek, Michigan, the captain gave the signal to the fifers to be silent. And the company of soldiers made their way 1 mile march, keeping step to music of the drum and Henry's whistle. So 14-year-old Henry was providing the whistling so the soldiers would march according to that. What about the membership status? We know that a number of Adventists served, voluntarily and involuntarily, but they served. What about the membership status of those who joined the Army or were drafted? Burton writes, it is also important to emphasize that the Adventists who voluntarily participated in the war were not uniformly disfellowshipped. There were those who were. And it is more likely that Adventists who held non-participatory views were disfellowshipped. So the disfellowshipping is a difficult thing, because if you just look at who was disfellowshipped, you don't always know the reasons. So he has tried to find out the actual reasons, to look at their records. Though these individuals did not lose their membership because of their pacifism, the split was rooted in disagreement between non-participation and conscientious objection. Burton writes, Adventist leaders never formally pressured churches to disfellowship their members who enlisted. However, and many churches retained their members while others disciplined their members in an uneven fashion. So there was no consistency of what was done with these soldiers, either who volunteered or who were drafted into the military. The question of membership was not dealt with consistently. Here are just a few examples. Two brothers enlisted. One was disfellowshipped, the other one wasn't. A man by the name of Nelson Russ from Monterey, Michigan, a little rural community, but they had quite a significant Adventist church at one time between Battle Creek and Grand Rapids, in that area. Joined the Army February 8, 1865, just shortly before the war was over, in April of 1865. He was disfellowshipped in May 1865, 3 months after joining. No reason was given, but Burton writes the following. It is possible that he was disfellowshipped for enlisting in the Army, but he may also have been disfellowshipped because he was aligning with Mormonism at that time. He was mustered out of the army in Utah, and he actually, according to Kevin, became a significant Mormon leader. He left the Adventist faith. So it's not known. Was it because he went into the military voluntarily, or is it because he became a Mormon? Kevin thinks it's more than Mormonism, but we don't know for sure. Another member in Monterey, Michigan, John Wilson, was disfellowshipped for not for enlisting, but rather for violating the fourth commandment. So the participation in the war was not the issue, it was the violation of the Sabbath in the war. Shortly thereafter, Wilson was put back on the official membership list. After the Civil War, he re-enlisted July 19, 1866. It'll be about 3 months after the war ended. He enlisted and fought in the Indian Wars. His name was on the books during that service in the Army, so they never took any action while he was in the Indian Wars. What about Seventh-day Adventists and non-combatancy during the war, during the U.S. Civil War? The Civil War started April 12, 1861, and it ended April 9, 1865. Almost 4 years to the day. Officially, it ended a little bit later, but when Lee surrendered to Grant in Appomattox, the war was over. The President of the Confederacy didn't think so yet, Jefferson, but it was over. On August 2, 1864, that's 3.5 years after the war started, the General Conference Committee for the first time declared, quote, the denomination of Christians calling themselves Seventh-day Adventists have ever been conscientiously opposed to bearing arms. That's the first action that was taken 3.5 years after the war started. And J.N. Andrews took that action, went to Washington, and on September 1, 1864, he writes that Adventists have been recognized as non-combatants. What about the period from the U.S. Civil War up to World War I? Quite a few years, close to some 50 years that actually transpired there. Action of the Third General Conference session in 1865 in part says, while we thus cheerfully render to Caesar the things which the Scripture shows to be his, we are compelled to decline all participation in acts of war and bloodshed as being consistent with the duties explained upon us by our divine Master toward our enemies, toward all mankind. That was one action. In 1867, the Fifth General Conference session, similar. We deem it our duty to yield and respect civil rulers and obedience and so on, in carrying out the principles we render tribute, custom, and reverence. Action of the Sixth General Conference session, 1868, after expressing support for the government, it voted the following, that we feel called upon to renew our request to our brethren to abstain from worldly strife of every nature, believing that war was never justifiable except under immediate direction of God. Ellen White, in 1886, wrote from Switzerland, a report that I think are all familiar with. And what is interesting to me about the report, it's almost like a reporter, or rather matter-of-factly, she talks about employees of the church, of the press, I think in particular, that they have to perform the military service and how they were leaving and how they were praying for them. Okay, that's found in Selected Messages, volume 2, page 355. We're all familiar with that word, are we not? Yeah, okay. But it's the nature of what she says there. This is what's going on. She's serving as a reporter and not really making any comments on it. February 6, 1895, report to the General Conference session by H.P. Holzer. Holzer was an American who was now president of the Central European Conference. He started his ministry under A.G. Daniels. He reports as following: the military question also of one is of equally significant. All of the regular army are expected to do the military service on the Sabbath. In the past, no one had to courage to refuse to serve on the Sabbath, but we consider this as bad and doing any other secular work on the Sabbath. Moreover, the question arises, can we join the army at all? Where will these armies finally be? They'll be drawn up against the Lord, and sometimes or other we must get out of them and be on the Lord's side. But how can we get out? Continues. It seems to me that once the question is settled as a whole, and there's the Sabbath question. If a man keeps the Sabbath, he will soon get out of the army. They will put him in prison, banish him, or dispose of him in some way. Many of our people are waking up to this question, and I doubt whether many of them will serve any more on the Sabbath. It was a hot issue. There was not universal consistency that was taking place. The question that was being debated in his report is not so much about the bearing of arms as it is the Sabbath issue. And this, you will find, happens over and over in the reports up to World War I. April 4, 1903, Conradi reports to the GC session, including the following statement. A few years ago, some of our young men in Germany had to face a serious problem. Whether, if they entered the military service, they would serve on the Sabbath day or not. It is not an easy thing in Germany, where army regulations are so strict in every way for young men to face such a problem. Conradi then recounts several anecdotes. May 18, 1905, session delegates, Conradi again is reporting, the authorities in Germany had decided no one should have the Sabbath off in the required military service, but God has stood by young men who are steadfast and true, and the freedom has been granted. The emperor has pardoned several. One young man told the authorities that years ago his father had repeatedly suffered imprisonment for refusing duties on the Sabbath. The record was looked up, and the young man's colonel told the whole regiment that he was to have the Sabbath free, and no one was to cast reproach against him. Again, the issue was not compulsory military service, but it was what to do with the Sabbath question. May 23, 1909, during the General Conference session, a report from the Scandinavian Union president, Conradi, gave the report. As in nearly all European countries, I quote, at a certain age, every young man is obliged to do military service for a certain length of time. The military authorities have shown our young men all the kindness that could be expected. We need only to write a letter certifying that they are members of our denomination and they are released from work on the Sabbath and permitted to attend church. Again, the central issue is over and over, not so much the bearing of arms or serving in the military, but it is about Sabbath keeping. May 28, the same General Conference session of 1909, during the Religious Liberty Report, a missionary from South Africa reported that, quote, a young brother who was arrested some time ago for refusing to do military service on the Sabbath and suffered much for a time in the hands of the officers is now well treated by his superiors. He was given special privilege and not obliged to complete his term of military service. Again, it's a question of Sabbath keeping. Even from Japan, a report was given at the same time how a brother in Japan had to deal with the question, and it was again an issue of Sabbath service in the military. This suggests, these reports, there was no standard report response to military service outside of North America, and as we have noticed, also within North America. In other words, while the church took some actions, what actually was happening was sometimes different. The church at times urged, asked people, but what was happening varied significantly. Before World War I, May 17, 1913, just before the war, less than a year, GC session, during the Religious Liberty Report, a German-Swiss delegate stated, quote, that many hundreds of young men have been exempt from the military on religious grounds, but that the present war pressure under which European countries are now all resting, has changed this condition. The latest edict is to effect that all religious bodies must teach their sons the importance of military service or suffer under the penalty of an imperial act. However, this report was followed by Conrad telling a story. Quote, a young man doing military service in the army who was put in prison because of his refusal to break on the Sabbath. So it was inconsistent what was being done with these individuals. He was then released, this young man, for his faithfulness, but again, the issue arose in regards to military services because of the Sabbath duties rather than combatancy. While others were clearly, many Adventists actually doing their military service in German army, even some had been exempted on religious grounds. Same General Conference session. In this report to the session, the president of the Danube Union refers to the experience of 9 Bulgarian Adventists who, quote, were called to do military service and called to the front during the recent Balkan War, which, as we know, preceded the World War I. One had been wounded in battle. The report stressed how the young Adventist men had the opportunity to hold Bible readings before their officers and comrades and took advantage of the opportunity to witness, rather than refusal to bear of arms or even carry out on the Sabbath duties. So the issue seems to be over and over, Sabbath and not the carrying of arms. The 1913 session, if you read those minutes, underscores the impression that accepting military service and bearing of arms was practiced in many of these countries, as we've noticed in the United States and we've noticed in European countries. World War I and Ellen White. World War I started July 23, 1914. Ellen White died July 16, 1915, just about a year. She was aware of the war. She was aware. We'll relate just a couple of incidents here, as reported by Chrysler and Willie White. Arthur White, her biographer, reports that Chrysler spoke to Ellen White on October 20, 1914. By now, the war was going on. 3 months after the war started, Chrysler said the following: the brethren in Europe were reaching out for counsel and asking whether Ellen White had any light. She gave no specific counsel on the matter, except that under such circumstances, the Christian should not act presumptuously. Willie White wrote on May 26, 1915, to Guy Dale. He was a secretary of the European Division. He writes that some of the members, quote, think it would have been better for them to have refused to bear arms, even if they knew that as a result of this refusal, they would be made to stand up and be shot. According to W.C. White, as is reported by Arthur White. And Ellen White, according to him, stated, I do not think they ought to do that. That's what Willie White reported. They ought to not do that. Arthur White concludes, it is clear that she had no special light that would pinpoint how drafted Seventh-day Adventists should relate to demands of military service. I end the timeline here. The developments in the church during World War II really deserve a separate study. Those developments are complex, for during that period many suffered because of the war and many experienced pain from what was happening in the church. It was a double suffering. The church was going through a very painful period. We all are aware of that. And they were going through the horrors of the war. World War I was complex and brutal. It involved many people and many countries. It was truly a world war, something that had never happened on the same scale in the history of the world. It was so devastating an experience for the church, it also brought major dissension into the church. And we all are aware of that. I want to focus on 2 areas in my last part of the presentation. First, What can we learn about military service and Seventh-day Adventism based on the developments at the time the Adventist Church started, and forming a movement, and from the Civil War and up to World War I? What can we learn during that period? What happened? If we carefully review this period, I believe we'll be prepared to do a responsible study of what happened during World War I. I don't think we can begin with World War I. We have to begin with the Civil War, because that leads up to it. And usually we don't talk about that part, but some of our researchers have now opened those doors, and because it's not that the church suddenly changed in World War I. There's quite a bit of continuation of what had been happening all along. So, here's some questions that I am raising, some points. The question of participation in war was not a central question in the formation of Seventh-day Adventism. In the 1840s, 1850s, as Adventism grew out of the Millerite movement, that was not an issue. There was no discussion about that. One could say there was no war. Well, there were some wars. America was involved in some of the wars with Mexico, and Indian wars, and so on. But in that period of time, in other words, the question of military service was not a central point of formation. This is not around the point which they coalesced, as some other denomination like the Quakers did. They didn't do that. It was not a formative issue. What was central to them, the early Adventists, was, the Second Coming, the Sabbath came into it, the Seventh-day Adventists read the resurrection, or the state of the dead, as we refer to it sometime, the sanctuary. These were central issues. The war issue doesn't come up until the Civil War shows up. The question of bearing of arms, my next point, in war and Sabbath keeping was thrust upon Seventh-day Adventists during the U.S. Civil War. That's when it became an issue. And they had to grapple with it. What do we do? Being a church that was very allergic to creeds, right? Very allergic to creeds, and for many years. And we still say we don't have creeds, and I think you say the same thing. We have fundamental beliefs, we say, but we don't have creeds. Being a church that was allergic to creeds, when Civil War came upon, the question was, what do we do now? They could not look up some kind of creed and say, this is what we do. They had to deal with the question and grapple with it. And that's when you read the pages of the Adventist Review, the Review and Herald of that period, there was quite a bit of dissension from one end to the other on this. So the question arose during the Civil War. Next point. There is evidence that a significant number of Seventh-day Adventists volunteered to serve in the U.S. military during the Civil War, or that they answered the draft. The numbers keep growing. And that is a fact that I don't think has been looked upon very much in the past. But there is evidence that their patriotism for the country, remember what I said, there were hardly any Adventists in the South at that time. It was a northern church. New England, New York, Ohio, parts of Ohio, more northern Ohio, Iowa, kind of a strange situation almost that they got planted, but we know why that happened in Iowa and some of those areas. That's where they were. This was the bedrock of anti-slavery. And the rural people in particular were anti-slavery in these areas. City was not the same thing. I've read quite a bit on the issue of the Underground Railroad in New York City. There was a terribly corrupt court system in New York City, for example, that many slaves were returned. But this didn't happen in the rural areas. They banded together for protection. They were very much anti-slavery. To them, this was a rebellion against established government. My next point, those who questioned participation in the war focused more on the Sabbath question and not so much on the bearing of arms. We just don't find a lot of discussion about the bearing of arms that took place during that time. Next point, the question of membership of those who either volunteered or answered the draft was an issue, but there was no uniformity. A significant number served in the military and their membership was not questioned. None whatsoever. No records of any kind of action against these individuals. Ellen White, my final point to that question is, Ellen White ministered to the church for over 50 years after the Civil War, altogether some 70 years. But some 50 years after the Civil War and until her death. She referred to the question of military service, but she did not give specific direction that would apply to the broad issue. You keep looking, you know, I sometimes wish there would be something more specific, but it's not there. It's just not, it's not there. I reported what she said to Chrysler and what she said to Willie White. My second concluding point is this, or question is this. What are the general principles that have or are guiding the Seventh-day Adventist Church as to military service by church members? What are the principles? One, the Seventh-day Adventist Church has never made the question of military service a fundamental belief. Whether we agree with it or not, it wasn't done in the early years. It wasn't done during Ellen White's time, and has not been done ever since. That is a fact. And I think it's a fact that we have to deal with. Why didn't it rise to the level of other issues? Two, the church has taken action in support of non-combatancy. That's true. At the 1954 General Conference session, for example, and reconfirmed and redefined even, refined it in more detail in the same year, 1954, at the Annual Council. And again, at the 1972 Annual Council. There's no question about that. That is the position that the church took. I find that the following statement on non-combatancy in the Seventh-day Adventist Church is important. Ted Wilson, General Conference President, both historically accurate and it's reflective of the position of the church. He writes as follows, just this past summer. In addition to taking a non-combatancy position, the Seventh-day Adventist Church encourages its members not to join the military. And that is a true statement. I don't think we've run across, during the Civil War, for example, anywhere where the church officially says, go ahead and fight. And James White made a very, broad statement, But the church never said, go ahead. The church was very much against the rebellion. My own interpretation is there was, to such an extent, there was a natural thing for individuals to say, well, if you're against that, we've got to put it down. They looked upon it as, somebody attacking your home. What do? You take some action. At minimum, you're going to close the door. Or on the other extent, you're going to go after that individual to try to, persuade him either by words or by action not to attack you. So, Ted Wilson writes, in addition to taking a non-combatancy position, the Seventh-day Adventist Church encourages its members not to join the military. Nevertheless, and I emphasize this part, he did not, with just regular letters. In my notes, it's in bold. Nevertheless, it is not a test of membership. End of quote. And has never been a test of church membership. Has never been. Day one until now. Which, just reflecting, that's not unusual for Seventh-day Adventists. We have positions, we have taken positions on many different issues, but we have not voted all these things to be our official stance or a fundamental belief. And that's what we see here. So from the Civil War, when it became this terrible issue in the church, and all the way through the years that Ellen White lived, it never was voted as a fundamental issue. Or, well, we didn't have official fundamental beliefs at that time, but never made it to the top where this is the way we are. They took action saying, we don't want to fight in the war, this is who we are, but never made it an official belief. Here are 3 questions that I was debating whether I will even ask. So to myself, you know, I don't want to push it too far, but because we have a good spirit, I hope this good spirit continues, I will ask them. Okay? Is that okay?
Sure.
Well, all right, we're working as friends here.
Yeah.
And by the way, you know, we say these nice things at our dinner and so on, but they're not just nice words. This is a reflection of what has been. You know, we have worked together, we have prayed together, and we asked the Lord to lead us. So I asked these 3 questions, or these 3 points. Does a different interpretation as to participation in war justify the formation of a new denomination? If yes, then that new denomination should have started during the Civil War, because different interpretations in the question of participation in war existed at that time. Why didn't it start during the Civil War? Now, I understand enough of the history of the Reform movement that it wasn't just the participation, it was also the question of how some of those members were treated. But, a pastor always has a but, following comment. But, I remind you of this. Church membership and the issue of discipline can be an awfully messy issue. We don't need the war to always create a problem. We know how that works sometimes. Battle Creek, those of you who are more familiar with that period, that's not my area of expertise. Didn't they have one time where nearly half the church was this fellowship, Tim?
It was more than half.
Well, I was going to say more, but I didn't want to be that bold.
No, it was like 2/3.
Yeah, I mean, had nothing to do with the war, and I'm not sure they could quite figure out what happened yet.
That's right.
You know, is that true?
That's right.
Yeah, you know, just somebody got this wild idea.
Ladies Fellowship, Uriah Smith, who was the Michigan Conference president. But
So
they took it all back a little
yeah,
while later.
but for a while we had a non-Adventist who was a conference president, right?
And editing the review.
And editing, I mean, double sin. So the point I'm making is that justification? I know people were mistreated, but that happens all the time. I've been a pastor for 48 years in just a couple of weeks. Some of you aren't 48 years old, or close to it. And I look back at those years, and it's amazing how creative we sometimes can be in our evil deeds. Okay? Second point. The church is international. It needs to focus on its central teachings. It has a worldwide mission. What do I mean by that? There are differences that exist in how we view issues. They are. And the more we broaden what is central, the more difficulty we will have. I like the Sabbath school lesson that we had, 2 Sabbaths ago, that Denny Fortin is the main contributor to it, where he identified what is central to Seventh-day Adventism. You know, I like that. I think it's very helpful. And as a pastor, I've been a congregational pastor, I've been an administrator, worked different roles over the years. You know, can we tolerate each other even though we differ? I have followed, as a pastor, pretty much the rule, you may have different views, and I may not agree with you, and you may be outside of mainline Adventism, but you know, let's be patient and give you a chance to work it out. But if you create a problem in the church, then we got an issue. The church is an international body. In 1914, I'm suggesting that we did not abandon established policies and practices. If we believed that in the Civil War we were truly conscientious objectors, that we did not participate, and that all the years after that, up to the World War I, that we stayed faithful to the idea of no participation, no carrying of weapons, then World War I is significant. But what I'm saying is, we did not change. It's just that the that the war was so much broader and deeper, and the wounds were so much worse in World War I, because it affected so many people in so many countries. But essentially what happened in World War I is what happened in the Civil War. Except there was a little bit easier to identify the enemy, at least the Adventist thought so. It's the Southerners. That's who the enemy was, because they were pro-slave people. And the Northerners, there was no discussion going on. There was nothing to discuss. These are evil people. They rebelled. We uphold the government, and we're going to support the government. World War I comes, and you got multitudes of countries. You look at Europe. You know, how many countries were involved in that? And some of them, you know, small countries, so a few miles away from your home, somebody who should be your neighbor suddenly became an enemy. But we did not, in 1914, establish new policies and practices. Whether we like what we did in Civil War and the subsequent years, whether we like it or not, whether we believe it was the right or wrong, essentially what happened in World War I was a continuation of what had been happening all along. In other words, this is our position, and some places even change that, but that happens all the time in the church. You have local variations. This is our position, but brother, and it's usually brother, the sisters didn't have to deal with that issue at that time. Brother, do the best that you can. And I know myself, as a child who grew up in the Adventist Reform, you know, all the uncles that I had and older cousins, what they went through both before World War II and after World War II. Do the best that you can. I look back on those years, I do not condemn them. Some of them served in the military. My father did, but he was a member of the Reform. And you do the best that you can, and that's what they did. So World War I simply amplified what Adventists had done all along, but it made it much worse because of the vastness of the war. That's my presentation.